The alarm on my wrist buzzed twice, which meant someone important was about to walk through Corridor 7, and I needed to disappear. That was my life on Axis Pinnacle. Not fighting, not commanding, disappearing. I pressed my back against the supply closet wall and held 2 crates of atmospheric filters against my chest, while the Veanori Royal Guard marched past in a column of silver and light. Their armor hummed with telepathic resonance, and the air around them tasted like static electricity and crushed flowers. 7 feet tall, every one of them, with skin that glowed from the inside like living marble. They did not see me. They never did. My name is Ethan Cole, 29 years old, born in a small town outside of London. Degree in systems engineering from a university nobody in this galaxy has heard of. Current title, Logistics Attaché, Axis Pinnacle Station, Galactic Concord of Thrones. What that title actually means is that I count boxes. I check air filters. I make sure the methane blend in the Wraithak delegation quarters does not drop below 42%. Because if it does, their hive mind loses coherence, and 300 insectoid diplomats start screaming in unison. I learned that the hard way during my first week. I had been on this station for 2 years, and in that time, exactly 4 people had asked me my name. 2 of them were other maintenance workers who had since transferred. 1 was a medical officer running a mandatory health scan. The 4th was a doll shapeshifter who asked my name, repeated it back to me in a perfect imitation of my own voice, and then laughed for 45 seconds straight. Humans were new to the galactic stage. 40 years since first contact. 1 generation. We had been given a seat on the Concord of Thrones, the alliance of 12 alien empires that governed known space. But our seat was symbolic. No vote, no voice. A chair at the table so they could say they were inclusive while making every decision without us. Because in this galaxy, power was biological. The Veanori had telepathy. The Wraithak had hive-linked bioelectric fields. The doll could reshape their bodies at will. The Kreth manipulated gravity with their minds. Every ruling species had some inherited gift, some evolutionary miracle written into their blood. Humans had none of it. No telepathy, no telekinesis, no biological weapons. We could not read minds or bend light or commune with our species across star systems. We were just flesh and bone, and a brain that ran on glucose and coffee. The other species tolerated us the way you might tolerate a clever pet. Occasionally useful, frequently in the way, fundamentally lesser. I had accepted this, or at least, I had accepted the version of this that everyone else believed. What they did not know, what nobody on this station suspected, was that being invisible was the most powerful thing I had ever been. The Decadal Accord was starting in 3 hours. Every 10 years, the 12 thrones gathered to negotiate trade routes, military treaties, and resource allocations. It was the single most important political event in the galaxy, and Axis Pinnacle was hosting it. The station's population had tripled overnight, as delegations arrived with their warships and escorts and entourages. My workload had quadrupled. I had not slept in 31 hours, and I had just discovered that someone in the Kreth delegation had tried to install their own gravity generator in their quarters, which was pulling the station's rotational axis off by 0.3 degrees, and slowly dragging everything on Deck 9 toward the floor at an angle. I was on my way to fix it when I saw her for the first time. Princess Salith Veanora walked through the main atrium like light moving through water. She was tall even by Veanori standards, close to 7.5 feet, and her skin shifted between silver and pale gold with every step. The bioluminescence beneath her surface pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves, and where she walked, the air seemed to hum at a frequency just below hearing. Her eyes were solid violet, without pupil or iris, and they swept the room with the calm authority of someone who had never been told no. But it was not her appearance that stopped me. It was the effect she had on everyone around her. Diplomats who had been arguing fell silent. Guards who had been scanning for threats lowered their weapons. A Wraithak trade envoy, a species not known for emotional responses, actually trembled. It was her telepathy, not active, not deliberate, just the passive weight of a mind so powerful that it bent the thoughts of everyone nearby, like gravity bends light. I felt it too, a gentle pressure against the inside of my skull, like someone pressing a warm hand against a window. It wanted in. It was searching, instinctively, for the shape of my thoughts. It did not find them. I kept walking. I had filters to replace and a gravity generator to shut down before it ripped Deck 9 apart. The thing about telepaths is that they do not expect silence. Their gift works on every known sentient species. It reads surface thoughts the way your eyes read a sign. Automatic. Effortless. So when they encounter a mind that does not broadcast, they have two reactions. Either they assume the being is too simple to have thoughts worth reading, or they assume it is broken. In both cases, they move on. Salith moved on. I fixed the gravity generator. It took 40 minutes. A socket wrench I had fabricated myself because the station did not stock tools for human-sized hands, and a very firm conversation with the Kreth technician who had installed it. He was 8 feet of scaled muscle with hands that could crush stone, and he told me, in his grinding language, that I had no authority to touch Kreth equipment. I told him, in his own language, that if he did not shut down the generator, the resulting gravitational shear would crack the hull plating on Deck 9 and vent his entire delegation into vacuum. He stared at me for a long time. Then he shut it down. Nobody had taught me the Kreth language. I had learned it by listening to Kreth engineers argue over comm channels while I repaired conduits near their quarters. I spoke 6 alien languages fluently. I had never told anyone. There was no reason to. Nobody asked what the human knew. The banquet that evening was mandatory for all station personnel above the rank of maintenance technician. I was below that rank, but I went anyway, because the banquet hall shared a ventilation system with the service corridor on Deck 4, and the atmospheric scrubbers in that corridor needed recalibrating. If I happened to recalibrate them very slowly, right next to the vent that opened into the hall, that was simply the nature of thorough work. I heard 12 languages spoken in the space of an hour. I heard the Rethok matriarch compliment the Vaenori king on his daughter's composure, while her bioelectric field pulsed in the pattern that meant she was lying. I heard the Dahl ambassador promise open trade negotiations, while her assistant, in a whispered aside, used a word that meant, delay until they concede. I heard 2 Kreth generals discuss fleet positioning near the outer reach, in terms that sounded like casual small talk but contained coordinates. I wrote everything down. Not on a datapad, because datapads could be scanned. In a small leather journal I had brought from Earth, in a handwriting system I had invented myself, using a shorthand that combined English, Mandarin characters, and mathematical notation. Even if someone found it, they would see gibberish. But to me, it was 2 years of intelligence on every delegation, every alliance, every betrayal brewing beneath the polished surface of galactic diplomacy. Nobody was gathering this intelligence because nobody thought it needed gathering. The Concord had kept peace for 3 centuries. The thrones trusted their gifts to warn them of danger. Telepaths would sense hostile intent. Shapeshifters would detect imposters. Hive minds would coordinate defenses. The system worked. It had always worked. But I had noticed things. Small things. A Rithak cargo ship that arrived 3 days early with a manifest that did not match its hold. A Dahl cultural attaché who met with a Kreth military aide in a section of the station that had no surveillance, at a time when both should have been elsewhere. A subtle change in the communication encryption used by the Vaenori delegation, a change that was consistent with the protocols used during the Vaenori civil conflicts 2 centuries ago. Small things, meaningless things, if you looked at any one of them alone. I was not looking at them alone. The night after the first banquet, I returned to my quarters. A converted storage room on Deck 12, barely large enough for a cot and a small desk. The walls were bare metal. The light flickered at a frequency that most species could not perceive, but that gave me a headache if I stared at the ceiling too long. I had filed 3 requests to have it fixed. All 3 had been lost in the system. I sat on my cot and opened my journal to a page near the back. On it was a web of connections, names, dates, and observations, stretching back 23 months. It looked chaotic. It was not. Every line meant something. Every gap was a question I had not yet answered. I added the new data from the banquet, the Rithak matriarch's deceptive bioelectric patterns, the Dahl assistant's word choice, the Kreth fleet coordinates. I drew new lines. I erased old ones. I sat back and looked at the picture forming in front of me. Something was wrong with the Concord. Not the normal friction of 12 empires sharing a galaxy. Something structural. Something deliberate. Someone was pulling threads, and the tapestry was beginning to unravel in ways that the threads themselves could not see. I did not know who. I did not know why. I did not yet know how. But I knew it was happening, because I was the only person on this station who had no gift to rely on and no status to protect. I could only watch, and I had been watching for a very long time. The next morning, I was carrying a crate of thermal regulators through Corridor 3 when a Vianori guard stepped directly into my path. He was tall and broad, with the standard silver armor and the expression of someone who considered my existence a mild inconvenience. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood there, waiting for me to go around him. I shifted the crate to my left side and stepped to the right. He shifted with me. I stepped left. He followed. It was not accidental. It was a game. The kind that soldiers play when they are bored, and there is someone nearby who cannot fight back. I stopped moving and looked up at him. He was nearly 2 feet taller than me, and the glow beneath his skin brightened, the Vianori equivalent of a sneer. He said a word. Threnvek. In the Vianori language, it meant something between furniture and vermin, a thing that existed in spaces meant for real beings, not alive enough to address, not dead enough to discard. I had been called worse. I said nothing. I simply waited. After a moment, a voice came from behind the guard, sharp and clear, and carrying the unmistakable harmonic resonance of Vianori royalty. Salith told the guard to move. She did not ask. She did not suggest. She issued a command with the casual precision of someone who had been obeyed since birth. The guard stiffened, glanced back at her, and stepped aside without another word. She walked past me. For 1/2 second, her eyes dropped to mine, violet meeting brown. I felt that pressure again, the warm hand against the window of my mind, pressing gently, searching. She found nothing she could grip. I saw her brow crease, just slightly, a flicker of confusion so brief that anyone relying on telepathy to read her would have missed it entirely. But I was not relying on telepathy. I was relying on something much older. I was reading her face, the way humans have read faces for 200,000 years. Micro-expressions, muscle movements, the tiny involuntary signals that every species produces and that only humans have learned to decode without technology or gifts. She was confused, and underneath the confusion, buried beneath layers of royal composure, she was curious. Then she was gone, and I was standing in an empty corridor, holding a crate of thermal regulators, my heart beating just a fraction faster than usual. That night, in my quarters, I wrote one line in my journal, separate from the intelligence web, in the margin where I kept personal observations. She tried to read me twice. She will try again. When she does, she will push harder, and when she pushes harder, she will find something that no Vianori has ever found in the mind of another being. She will find a door she cannot open, not because it is locked, because it was never designed for her kind of key. I put the journal under my pillow and stared at the flickering light on the ceiling. The decadal accord had begun. 12 thrones, 100 delegations, 1,000 secrets. And me, the human who counted crates. I closed my eyes and let my mind do what it had been doing for 2 years, what it had been doing for my entire life, what human minds had been doing since the first one looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. I thought. The body was cold when I found it. It was the 3rd morning of the decadal accord, and I was running a routine check on the atmospheric recyclers in the Kreth delegation wing. The recyclers on Deck 8 had been pulling slightly more power than usual, and when recyclers pull extra power, it usually means a filter is clogged or a seal has cracked. Neither is dangerous on its own. But on a station housing 12 of the most powerful political figures in the galaxy, I did not leave anything to usually. The door to Auxiliary Chamber 14 was supposed to be locked. It was not. The seal had been manually overridden, not hacked, not forced. Someone with clearance had opened it and had not closed it behind them. I pushed the door open with my elbow, both hands full of diagnostic equipment, and the smell hit me before my eyes adjusted to the dim light. Not decay, not yet. Something sharper, chemical. A faint metallic sweetness that I recognized from my university chemistry courses as an oxidized compound of selenium, and something I could not immediately place. Ambassador Drethan of the Kreth Ascendancy was lying on the floor between two deactivated power conduits. He was a large being, even for a Kreth. 9 feet of dense scaled muscle, with the crest of a senior diplomat and the ceremonial gravitational bands still wrapped around his forearms. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. The scales around his neck had turned a shade of gray that meant the blood beneath had stopped moving. I set down my equipment. I did not touch the body. I did not call for help immediately. Instead, I did something that 2 years of invisibility had trained me to do better than anyone else on this station. I looked. The official investigators arrived 40 minutes after I reported the body. A team of Vayanori security officers. Because the Vayanori controlled station security during Concord events, they swept the room with telepathic scans, searching for psychic residue, the emotional echoes that violent acts leave in the mental fabric of a space. They found nothing. They ran bioscanners. They checked the ambassador's vital implants. Cause of death, they concluded within the hour, was a cardiac event. Natural causes. The ambassador had been old for a Kreth. His hearts had simply stopped. They were wrong. I knew they were wrong because of 3 things they did not notice. First, the chemical smell. Oxidized selenium compounds do not occur naturally in Kreth biology. Someone had introduced a substance into this room, something that had reacted with the station's atmosphere and broken down almost completely, leaving only that faint metallic trace. A trace that a Vayanori nose, calibrated for pheromones and psychic markers, would not detect. But a human nose, evolved over millions of years to identify thousands of chemical compounds at parts per billion, caught it easily. Second, the ambassador's gravitational bands. They were still active, still calibrated to his personal frequency. If a Kreth dies of natural causes, their bands lose coherence within seconds. These bands were perfectly tuned. Someone had recalibrated them after death to simulate a living signature, buying time before the body was discovered. Third, and most important, the door. The override code used to open it belonged to a security clearance level that only 12 individuals on the station possessed. 12. I knew this because I had helped install the security system myself, 18 months ago, on a quiet afternoon, when the chief engineer needed an extra pair of hands, and the human was the only one not busy with important work. I tried to tell them. I approached the Vayanori security chief, a tall officer named Commander Valeth, and requested a moment of his time. He looked at me the way you might look at a chair that had suddenly tried to speak. I explained my findings: the chemical trace, the gravitational bands, the door override. He listened for approximately 90 seconds. Then he told me, in a tone that was not unkind but was absolute, that atmospheric chemistry was not my area of expertise, that Kreth physiology was beyond my understanding, and that the matter had been resolved. He suggested I return to my duties. He did not file a report. I stood in the corridor after he walked away, and felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in 2 years. Not anger, frustration. The particular kind of frustration that comes from seeing a fire starting and being told that you are not qualified to smell smoke. I went back to my quarters. I opened my journal. I added the details of the ambassador's death to the web of connections I had been building for 23 months. And as I drew the new lines, as I traced the relationships between the early cargo ship and the secret meeting and the changed encryption protocols, the picture sharpened in a way that made my stomach drop. The ambassador's death was not an isolated event. It was a step. A carefully planned, precisely executed step in a sequence that had been unfolding for months, perhaps years. And the sequence pointed toward something I had only suspected, but now believed with growing certainty. Someone was going to destroy the Concord of Thrones. Not weaken it, not reform it, destroy it. And they were going to do it before the Decadal Accord ended, in the next 7 days. While every throne was gathered in one place, and the galaxy's attention was focused on a single point of light in the darkness. I needed to tell someone who would listen. The problem was finding someone on a station of 10,000 beings who considered a human worth listening to. The banquet that evening was more tense than the first. News of Ambassador Drethan's death had spread, and while the official explanation of natural causes had been accepted publicly, I watched the delegations from my usual position in the service corridor and saw the truth written in body language and bioelectric patterns, and subtle shifts in posture. The Rithak matriarch had doubled her personal guard. The doll ambassador had changed her appearance 3 times in the past hour, a sign of extreme anxiety in a shape-shifting species. 2 Kreth generals who had been friendly with Ambassador Drethan were absent from the banquet entirely, and their aides were sending encrypted bursts on a frequency I could detect through the service corridor's communication relays. I was not supposed to be able to detect encrypted communications, but 8 months ago, I had repaired a faulty relay junction on Deck 6, and in the process, I had discovered that the junction created a harmonic echo of any signal that passed through it. I had not reported the flaw. Instead, I had wired a small receiver into my diagnostic equipment that captured the echoes. I could not decrypt them, but I could track their frequency, origin, and destination. I could see who was talking to whom, even if I could not hear what they were saying. Tonight, the Kreth aides were talking to someone in the Rithak delegation, and the Rithak delegation was talking to someone whose signal originated from inside the Vaynori wing. 3 delegations, 3 encrypted channels, 1 dead ambassador. The web was growing. I left the service corridor and made a decision that went against every instinct I had developed in 2 years of careful invisibility. I went to find Princess Salith. It was not a strategic choice. It was a desperate one. I had no allies on this station. No connections, no influence, no leverage. Every official channel had dismissed me. Every authority figure saw me as furniture. But Salith had looked at me twice with something other than indifference. She had shown curiosity. And in my experience, curiosity was the only crack through which truth could enter a closed mind. I found her in the lower observation gallery, 3 decks below the banquet hall. She was alone, which surprised me. Vaynori royalty did not wander alone, but she was standing at the viewport, her luminescence dimmed to a soft amber glow, watching the stars with an expression that I read, in the human way, as exhaustion. She sensed me before I spoke. Her head turned, and those violet eyes found me in the shadows of the corridor, with a precision that confirmed what I already knew about Vaynori spatial awareness. She said 1 word. Human. I said my name. Ethan Cole. She studied me for a moment. Then she said it back. Ethan Cole. Testing the sounds. The faintest hint of amusement crossed her features, the way you might be amused by a dog that had learned a particularly clever trick. I did not have time for amusement. I asked her if she knew that Ambassador Drethan had been murdered. Her expression did not change, but her luminescence shifted, a brief flare of blue at the edges of her silver skin. Surprise. She controlled it almost instantly, but I had seen it. She told me the ambassador died of natural causes. She said it the way you say something you have been told to say. I asked her if she believed that. She was quiet for a long time. The stars drifted past the viewport behind her, slow and indifferent. Then she reached out with her telepathy again. I felt it immediately, that warm pressure against my thoughts. But this time it was different, stronger, more focused. Not a casual brush, but a deliberate probe, searching for the shape of what I knew. She pushed deeper than she had before, past the surface, past the layer where most minds keep their daily noise of hunger and fatigue and trivial concerns. She was looking for something specific, truth, intent. She wanted to know if I believed what I was saying, or if I was simply a human playing at importance. And she found what she found. I do not know exactly what my mind felt like to her. I can only describe what she told me later, in her own words, after everything had changed. She said it was like reaching into a pool of water expecting to touch the bottom, and discovering that there was no bottom, just depth, layer after layer of organized, structured, interconnected thought, extending further than she could reach. Not a wall, not resistance, just complexity so dense that her telepathy could not find a single thread to pull. She pulled her mind back. Her luminescence had shifted to a color I had not seen before, a deep violet that pulsed once, slowly. She asked me what I was. I told her I was a logistics attaché. I counted boxes. She did not laugh. She looked at me the way a scientist looks at an anomaly that should not exist according to every model they trust, and she asked me to explain what I meant about the ambassador. So I told her. Everything. The chemical trace, the gravitational bands, the door override, the early cargo ship, the secret meetings, the changed encryption protocols, the communication patterns I had been tracking for months. I laid it out the way I had laid it out in my journal, connection by connection, strand by strand, and I watched her expression shift from skepticism to attention, to something that looked, from the outside, like the beginning of fear. When I finished, she was silent for nearly a minute. Then she asked me why I had come to her. I told her the truth, because I had tried every official channel, and no one would listen to a human. Because she was the only person on this station who had looked at me twice. Because in 6 days, something catastrophic was going to happen, and I could not stop it alone. She asked me why I thought she would help. She was Vayanori. Her family controlled station security. If there was a conspiracy, her people would have detected it. I told her that was exactly the problem. The conspiracy was designed to be invisible to telepaths. It was built on logistics, on physical evidence, on the kind of low-technology, mechanical tradecraft that psychic species had stopped looking for centuries ago. Whoever was behind this understood that the Concorde's greatest strength, its array of biological gifts, was also its greatest weakness. They had built a plot that existed entirely in the gaps between those gifts. And the only reason I had found it was because I lived in those gaps. I had no gift. I had no power. I had nothing but my eyes, my ears, my nose, and a brain that had spent 29 years learning to survive without shortcuts. She looked at me for a long time. The observation gallery was quiet. The stars turned slowly beyond the viewport. Then she said something that changed everything. She said, "I cannot read you. I have read the minds of generals and kings and beings older than your species. I have never met a mind I could not read. But yours is not closed to me. It is simply built in a way I do not understand. And that means either you are something entirely new, or you are something very old that we have forgotten how to see." I told her I was just a human. She shook her head slowly, and the light beneath her skin pulsed in a pattern I had learned to recognize over 2 years of observation. It was the pattern Vayanori produced when they encountered something that challenged a fundamental assumption about reality. She said, "No, you are not just anything." Then she turned back to the viewport, and her reflection in the glass overlapped with the stars, silver skin against white points of light, and she told me to show her everything I had. I did not hesitate. I had been waiting 2 years for someone to say those words. We worked through the night in a maintenance bay on Deck 14 that I had chosen because its communication relays were offline for scheduled repairs, which meant no one could listen in. I spread my journal across the workbench and translated my shorthand into terms she could follow, drawing the web of connections in the air with a holographic projector I had borrowed from a supply closet. Salith watched without interrupting. Occasionally she would reach out with her telepathy, not toward me, but toward the data itself, as if she could sense the truth behind the connections through some psychic intuition I did not share. Each time, she came back with the same expression: troubled, convinced, afraid. By the time the station's artificial dawn began to brighten the corridors, we had identified 3 critical nodes in the conspiracy: the Rythak military faction that had sent the early cargo ship, the Dahl operative who had been meeting with the Kreth aide, and a signal that kept appearing in the encrypted communications, a signal that originated from somewhere inside the Vayanori delegation's own wing. Salith did not want to believe the last part. I watched her struggle with it, the luminescence beneath her skin flickering between silver and dark blue, and I understood what it cost her. To accept that someone in her own house might be involved in a plot to destroy the Concorde was to accept that everything she had been raised to trust, blood, lineage, the inherited loyalty of her people, might be flawed. I told her something then that I had not planned to say. I said that trust built on blood is only as strong as the weakest vein. That real trust is built on choice, on evidence, on the decision to believe in someone not because you share their biology, but because you share their purpose. She looked at me as if I had said something in a language she had never heard but somehow understood. She told me she would bring the evidence to her father, King Vorath of the Vayanori Dominion. He would listen. He was wise. He was just. He would act. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her, because we were running out of time, and she was the only door I had left. She left the maintenance bay as the first shift crew began to move through the corridors. I cleaned up every trace of our work. packed my journal into the hidden compartment I had built beneath the floor panel of my quarters, and went back to counting crates. 6 days remained. Salith returned to me 12 hours later, and I knew from the color of her skin before she said a word that something had gone terribly wrong. She was pale, not the luminous silver white of her natural state, but a flat, matte gray that I had seen only once before, on a Vaenori soldier who had received news of a family death. Her eyes were darker than usual. The violet deepened to something close to black, and she moved with the stiff precision of someone holding themselves together through force of will alone. She found me in the service corridor on Deck 7, where I was replacing a ventilation seal. She did not greet me. She did not use my name. She said 4 words. He already knew. I set down my tools. The corridor was empty. The nearest surveillance node was offline because I had taken it down for maintenance 3 hours ago. A coincidence that was not a coincidence. She told me what had happened. She had gone to her father. She had presented the evidence, the chemical trace, the gravitational bands, the encrypted communications. She had laid it out carefully, methodically, the way I had shown her. And King Vorath had listened. He had listened to every word. He had asked clarifying questions. He had examined the journal notes she had transcribed. And then he had told her the truth. The Vaenori knew about the conspiracy. They had known for months, not because their telepathy had detected it, but because they were part of it. Not the architects, not the instigators, but knowing participants. King Vorath had been in communication with elements of the Rythak military faction for over a year, coordinating the destabilization of the Concord with the goal of positioning the Vaenori Dominion as the dominant power in the aftermath. The Decadal Accord was not going to end in agreement. It was going to end in chaos. Manufactured chaos, precisely timed, designed to shatter the trust between the thrones so completely that the only path forward would be submission to the strongest remaining power. And the Vaenori, with their telepathy, their fleet, and their control of Axis Pinnacle's security, intended to be that power. Ambassador Drethin had been eliminated because he had discovered the plan. He was a moderate, a voice for cooperation, and he had intercepted a communication that would have exposed everything. So they silenced him, using a compound that mimicked cardiac failure, and left no trace detectable by psychic forensics. No trace detectable by psychic forensics, but detectable by a human nose. I asked Salith what her father had said about me. She told me. He had called me a clever animal. He had said that my observations were impressive for a species of my limitations, but that I had made the mistake of bringing my findings to the one family that could not afford to act on them. He had ordered my arrest, not execution. The Vaenori did not waste resources unnecessarily, but containment, quiet, permanent containment in the lower detention level, where I would remain until the accord ended and the new order was established. She asked me why I was not afraid. I told her I was afraid. I told her that fear was a constant companion for every human who had ever lived, because we had spent our entire evolutionary history as prey before we became something else. But I also told her that fear had never stopped a human from thinking, and thinking was the only weapon I had. She asked me what we were going to do. I noticed the word, we. Before I could answer, the sound of armored footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Vaenori guards, at least 4, moving in tactical formation. They were coming for me. Salith reacted faster than I expected. She grabbed my arm, and the contact sent a jolt through me. Not painful, but electric, as if her bioluminescence was vibrating at a frequency my nervous system could feel. She pulled me through a maintenance hatch that I knew led to the secondary conduit network, a maze of narrow passages that ran between the station's main corridors like veins beneath skin. I had mapped every inch of it during my 2 years of invisible work. We moved through the conduits in darkness. I led, because I knew the way, and she followed. Her luminescence dimmed to the faintest possible glow. Behind us, I could hear the guards entering the corridor we had just left, their comm channels crackling with urgent commands. We emerged on Deck 14, in the same maintenance bay where we had worked the night before. I sealed the hatch behind us and activated the signal dampener I had installed months ago, originally to prevent interference with sensitive calibration work. Now it would prevent anyone from detecting our communications or our location. Salith stood in the middle of the bay, her arms wrapped around herself, her skin cycling through shades of gray and blue. She was processing something. Not just the betrayal, something deeper. Something about the foundations of everything she had been raised to believe. She asked me a question then, and I could hear in her voice that it was not casual. It was not political. It was the kind of question that a person asks when the ground beneath them has vanished, and they are reaching for anything solid. She asked me how humans survived, not in the galaxy, on Earth, before space travel, before technology, before any of it. How did a species with no gifts, no natural advantages, no inherited power, manage to become the dominant life form on their planet? I told her. I told her about the savannah, where our ancestors stood upright not because they were strong but because they needed to see over the grass. I told her about persistence hunting, where humans chased prey for hours, not faster but more enduring, outlasting animals that could sprint but could not sustain. I told her about the development of language, the ability to coordinate, to plan, to share information across generations through stories and symbols. I told her about tools, the first time a hand picked up a rock and saw not a rock but a possibility. I told her that every great civilization in human history was built not by the strongest or the fastest or the most gifted, but by the ones who refused to stop thinking, who looked at a problem that should have destroyed them and said, "No, there is a way through this. I just have to find it." Who built bridges and ships and telescopes and medicine and mathematics and music, all from nothing, all from the raw material of a brain that ran on glucose and stubbornness. I told her that her species, the Vinori, the Rythak, the Doll, all of them, had been handed their power. Evolution, or whatever force shaped life in this galaxy, had given them telepathy, and bioelectrics, and shape-shifting. They were born with advantages. They had never needed to struggle for understanding, because understanding came pre-installed. But humans had to earn every single thing they knew. Every insight was won through failure and persistence. Every tool was invented because the alternative was extinction. Every strategy was developed because someone, somewhere, was desperate enough to think harder than any being had ever thought before. I told her that this was why her telepathy could not read me. Not because I was immune, not because humans were special in some mystical way, but because my mind was self-built. It was not a gift handed down through genetic inheritance. It was a structure I had assembled piece by piece, through study and discipline, and 2 years of lonely, invisible, relentless observation. Her telepathy was designed to interface with minds that followed patterns, inherited architectures, biological templates that had been refined over millions of years of evolution. My mind did not follow any template. It was improvised, original, and you cannot take apart something you do not have the blueprints for. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. The maintenance bay hummed around us. Somewhere above, the guards were searching for me, and the decadal accord was moving toward a catastrophe that would reshape the galaxy. Then she said something that I did not expect. She said, "I have been alive for 112 years. In that time, I have read the minds of thousands of beings, kings, scholars, warriors, artists, and I have never, not once, encountered a mind that made me feel like I was the one being studied. Until you." She paused. "You asked me why I came back, why I did not simply accept my father's orders and let you be taken. It was not loyalty. It was not compassion. It was because for the first time in my life, I looked at someone who had nothing, no power, no status, no gift, and I saw something that I, with all my centuries and all my abilities, have never had. I saw a mind that was entirely, completely, its own, and I wanted to understand what that felt like. I told her it felt like being tired most of the time, and scared, and overlooked, and stubborn enough to keep going anyway. She almost smiled, the first time I had seen anything close to warmth on a Vayanori face. Then the moment ended, because we both knew we were running out of time. 5 days remained before the accord concluded, and when it did, the conspiracy would trigger whatever event they had planned. The Vayanori would make their move, and the galaxy as we knew it would cease to exist. I opened my journal and spread it on the workbench. Together, we went through everything again, this time with Salith providing the pieces I had been missing, the internal Vayanori communications, the fleet movements she had access to as a princess, The identities of the Rethak military officers involved, names that matched gaps in my web with perfect, sickening precision. The plan was clearer now. The conspirators intended to trigger a confrontation between the Kreth and the Dahl on the 5th day of the Accord, using fabricated evidence of a Dahl espionage operation against the Kreth. The confrontation would escalate. The Rithak would intervene, ostensibly as peacekeepers, but in reality as aggressors. In the confusion, the Vaenori would seize control of Axis Pinnacle, declare the Accord void, and use their telepathic dominance to force the remaining thrones into submission. It was elegant, it was ruthless, and it relied entirely on one assumption, that no one would see it coming, because the beings with the power to see it were either part of it or looking with the wrong senses. I saw it, with my human eyes and my human brain, and my leather journal full of handwritten notes. But seeing it and stopping it were two very different things. I told Salith that I had a plan. She asked me what it was. I told her it involved the air ducts, a communication relay with a harmonic flaw, a gravitational calibration tool I had confiscated from the Kreth delegation, and every single piece of knowledge I had accumulated in 2 years of being the most invisible person on the station. She asked me if it would work. I told her the truth. I did not know. It was not a guaranteed strategy. It was an improvisation, a human improvisation, built from scraps and desperation, and the absolute refusal to accept that the situation was hopeless. She looked at me with those violet eyes, dark with fear and bright with something else, and she said, "Then let us improvise." I nodded. I closed my journal, and for the first time in 2 years, I stopped being invisible. The plan required 22 hours to prepare, and we had 20. So I did not sleep. Salith could not return to the Vaenori wing without being detained, so she stayed with me in the maintenance bay. It was the first time she had spent more than a few minutes in the lower decks of the station, and I watched her adjust to the reality of it. The flickering lights, the exposed conduits, the constant low hum of the recyclers that I had long since stopped hearing. She did not complain. She adapted. It was the first sign that she was more than her upbringing. I laid out the plan in stages. Stage 1 was communication. The conspirators' strength was secrecy. Their entire operation depended on the 12 thrones not knowing what the others were planning until it was too late. If I could expose the conspiracy to every delegation simultaneously, before the trigger event, the plan would collapse. You cannot orchestrate chaos when everyone sees the strings. The problem was delivery. Every official communication channel on Axis Pinnacle was controlled by Vaenori security, which meant it was controlled by King Vorath. I could not send a message through normal channels without it being intercepted and suppressed. But I could send a message through the harmonic flaw in the relay junction on Deck 6. I had discovered the flaw 8 months ago, and I had studied it carefully. The junction created an echo of any signal that passed through it, duplicating the transmission across every frequency band the junction handled. If I could feed a single message into the junction at precisely the right moment, the harmonic echo would broadcast that message on every communication frequency simultaneously, every delegation, every ship in orbit, every diplomatic channel, all at once, unavoidable, undeniable. The message would contain everything: the evidence of the conspiracy, the chemical analysis of the compound that killed Ambassador Drethin, the encrypted communication logs, the fleet movements, all of it, in every language I spoke, which was 6 of the 12 used by the Concord thrones. Salith could translate the remaining 6. Stage 2 was separation. Even if the message went out, the conspirators would try to seize control by force. The Rithak military faction had soldiers aboard the station, embedded in their delegation's security detail. The Vaenori had their royal guard. If these forces could coordinate, they could lock down the station and suppress the information before the other delegations could act. I needed to separate them, break their coordination, and I knew exactly how to do it, because I had spent 2 years maintaining the environmental systems that kept every delegation alive. The Rithak breathed a methane-oxygen blend. The Vaenori required a specific atmospheric pressure to maintain their bioluminescence. The Kreth needed a gravitational field calibrated to within 0.1% of their home world. Every delegation had specific environmental requirements, and those requirements were managed by isolated systems on each deck. If I triggered a cascading environmental alert, a series of atmospheric and gravitational fluctuations that threatened the life support of multiple delegations simultaneously. Every delegation's security forces would be forced to respond to the emergencies in their own sections. They could not coordinate an offensive while fighting to keep their own people alive, and the alerts would be real enough to demand attention, but carefully calibrated to be harmless. I knew the exact thresholds. I had calibrated them myself. Stage 3 was the lockdown. 6 months ago, I had submitted a maintenance protocol to the station's operating system, a subroutine designed to seal specific sections of the station in the event of a cascading environmental failure. It was a legitimate safety measure. I had written it, tested it, and submitted it through the standard maintenance channels. Nobody had reviewed it, because it was submitted by the human inventory clerk, and nobody reviewed submissions from the human inventory clerk. The protocol was already in the system, waiting. When I activated it, it would seal the corridors between the Vainori wing and the rest of the station, physically isolating the Royal Guard from the council chamber, where the Accord sessions were held. Stage 4 was me, walking into the council chamber and presenting the evidence directly to the assembled thrones, uninvited, unauthorized, a human standing in the most powerful room in the galaxy. Salith told me that Stage 4 was impossible, that the moment I entered the council chamber, her father would turn the full force of Vainori telepathy against me, that King Vorath had shattered the mental defenses of trained warriors, seasoned diplomats, and rival telepaths, that no unshielded mind had ever withstood a direct assault from a Vainori king. I told her that I did not intend to withstand it. I intended to let it pass through me. She did not understand. I tried to explain, and I realized that the concept I was describing did not have a word in any alien language I knew. The closest I could come was the human concept of cognitive flexibility, the ability to think in multiple dimensions simultaneously, to hold contradictory ideas without resolving them, to shift perspectives so rapidly and so fundamentally that any attack aimed at a fixed point finds nothing to hit. It was not a superpower. It was a skill, a human skill, developed over a lifetime of navigating a world that never stopped changing, never provided certainty, and never once offered a shortcut. She asked me if I was certain it would work. I told her I was not certain of anything. Certainty was a luxury for species with inherited gifts. Humans operated on probability, experience, and determination, and right now, my probability estimate was that I had about a 60% chance of surviving the encounter with her father's telepathy without permanent neurological damage. She told me those were terrible odds. I told her they were better than the odds humanity had faced when we climbed down from the trees. We spent the next 18 hours preparing. I rewired the relay junction on Deck 6, carefully modifying the harmonic flaw to amplify the echo rather than suppress it. Salith translated my evidence document into the remaining 6 languages, working from my notes with a speed and precision that reminded me she was not just a princess, but a trained diplomat, with a mind that could process information faster than most computers. I programmed the environmental alerts. 12 cascading failures, 1 for each delegation's section, timed to trigger in sequence over a period of 90 seconds. Each failure would be dramatic enough to demand immediate attention, but would resolve itself within 10 minutes, long enough to scatter the security forces, long enough for me to reach the council chamber. I tested the lockdown protocol. It responded perfectly. The maintenance subroutine I had planted 6 months ago was still there, untouched, unreviewed, exactly as I had left it. 6 months of patience, paying off in a single activation command. At the end of the 18 hours, I sat on the floor of the maintenance bay and ate a ration bar. Salith sat across from me, her luminescence dim, her violet eyes watching me with an expression I could not quite read. For a telepath who had spent her entire life reading others, she had become remarkably difficult to read herself. Or perhaps I was too tired to try. She asked me why I cared, why a human, a species the galaxy considered worthless, would risk his life to save a political system that had never given him anything but contempt. I thought about it. The honest answer was complicated, the way most honest answers are. Part of it was stubbornness, part of it was anger, not the hot kind, but the slow, patient kind that builds over 2 years of being called furniture. Part of it was something I did not have a good word for, but that might have been hope. The hope that if the Concord survived, it might become something better, something that had room for species without gifts. something that valued what you built over what you were born with. But mostly, I told her, it was because I was the only one who could. She nodded, as if this answer made perfect sense to her. The 20th hour arrived. The Accord session was scheduled to begin in 40 minutes. The conspirators' trigger event, the fabricated evidence against the doll, was set to be presented during the morning session. I stood up. I checked my equipment one final time. The relay junction transmitter, small enough to fit in my pocket. The environmental alert trigger, loaded onto a maintenance datapad. The lockdown activation code, memorized. Salith stood with me. She asked if there was anything else she could do. I told her there was one thing. When the environmental alerts triggered, the Vayanori guards would try to reach the council chamber. The lockdown would seal the corridors, but it would not hold forever. I needed someone to slow them down if the seals were breached. She told me she would. I asked her how. She smiled. It was the first real smile I had seen from her, and it transformed her face from something distant and luminous into something fierce and alive. She told me that she was still a Vayanori princess, and that her telepathy might not work on me, but it worked very well on guards who had been trained since birth to obey the royal family. I almost smiled back. Then I left the maintenance bay and walked toward the council chamber, and the fear that I had told Salith about, the fear that every human carries like a second heartbeat, walked with me. But so did everything else, every observation, every language, every connection in the web I had spent 2 years building, every lesson my species had ever learned about facing impossible odds with nothing but the machinery inside our skulls. I triggered the environmental alerts from the service corridor outside the council chamber. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Alarms erupted across 12 decks simultaneously. The methane levels in the Rithak wing spiked and then plummeted. The gravitational field in the Kreth section fluctuated wildly. The atmospheric pressure in the Vayanori wing dropped to a level that caused their bioluminescence to flicker and fade. On every deck, security forces scrambled to respond to what appeared to be a catastrophic system failure. I activated the lockdown. The heavy blast doors between the Vayanori wing and the central hub slammed shut with a sound that resonated through the station's hull like a drumbeat. On the other side, I could hear the Royal Guard shouting, their comm channels flooding with confusion. I transmitted the message. One pulse through the modified relay junction. The harmonic echo did the rest, carrying the evidence across every frequency band, every communication channel, every diplomatic circuit. In ships orbiting the station, in quarters on every deck, in offices and embassies and war rooms across the sector, screens lit up with the truth. And then I walked into the council chamber. The room was vast and circular, with 12 elevated platforms arranged around a central floor. Each platform held a throne, and behind each throne stood the sigils and banners of an empire. The ceiling was transparent, showing the stars above, and the light from a nearby nebula cast everything in shades of purple and gold. 11 of the 12 thrones were occupied. The Kreth delegation had lost a seat with Ambassador Drethan's death. The remaining delegates were in various states of alarm, their attention split between the environmental alerts and the transmissions now flooding their communication devices. King Vorath of the Vayanori sat on the tallest throne. He was ancient even by Vayanori standards, his skin a deep burnished silver, his luminescence controlled and steady despite the atmospheric fluctuations. His eyes were the same violet as his daughter's, but deeper, colder, carrying the weight of centuries of absolute authority. He saw me enter, a human, unauthorized, alone, walking across the floor of the council chamber with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. He struck. The full force of Vayanori royal telepathy hit me like a wall of light. It was not subtle. It was not a probe or a search. It was an assault, designed to overwhelm, to dominate, to crush a mind into submission so complete that the victim would not even remember the act of surrendering. Every delegate in the room buckled, even those who were not the target. The peripheral pressure alone was enough to make a doll ambassador lose her shape, her features blurring and reforming in waves. A Rithak general gripped the edges of his platform, his bioelectric field sparking uncontrollably. I felt it. Of course I felt it. It was like standing in the path of a flood. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to curl inward and protect whatever core of self I could preserve. I did not run. I did not hide. I did something that no being in the history of the Concord had ever done when faced with the full psychic force of a Vayanori king. I thought about rain, not as a defense, not as a shield. I simply let my mind do what human minds do when they are under pressure. I fragmented, not breaking, fragmenting. Every memory, every thought, every piece of who I was, scattered like light through a prism, becoming 1,000 smaller things that moved and shifted and reformed faster than any single force could track. I thought about the smell of coffee at 3 in the morning in my university dormitory, solving equations while my roommate snored. I thought about the sound of my mother's voice reading to me when I was small. I thought about the taste of rain on my tongue when I was 7, standing in a field behind my house with my arms spread wide, laughing at the sky. I thought about the equations of orbital mechanics, and the grammar of the Kreth language, and the way Salith's skin had flickered blue when I told her the truth. I thought about everything, all at once, and the telepathic assault passed through me the way wind passes through a net, not because I was stronger, because I was too many things at once to be grasped. Vorath pushed harder. I felt the pressure increase, felt it searching for the center of me, the single point where identity lives, the place where a mind can be gripped and bent. He could not find it, because there was no single point. Human identity is not a fortress with a gate. It is a river. It flows. It changes. It adapts. You can dam it, but it will find another path. You can freeze it, but it will melt. You can try to hold it, and it will slip through your fingers and keep moving. I stood in the center of the council chamber, and I did not kneel. The king's assault faltered. I saw it in his face, the first crack in 1,000 years of certainty. His luminescence flared, bright and hot, and then dimmed. Around the chamber, the other delegates were staring, not at me, at him, at the Vayanori king who had just thrown everything he had at a human and failed. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I spoke. I did not shout. I did not demand. I simply spoke, in 6 languages, rotating between them so that every delegate heard at least one sentence in their own tongue. I presented the evidence. I named the conspirators. I described the plan. I pointed to the transmissions that were already on every screen in the galaxy. And when I was finished, I stood there, a human, an inventory clerk, the man who counted crates. I stood there, and I waited for the galaxy to decide what it was going to become. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted them because counting was what my mind did when it needed to stay anchored, and after withstanding the full telepathic assault of a Vayanori king, my mind needed every anchor it could find. Then the Rithak matriarch spoke. Her bioelectric field was still flickering from the peripheral effects of Vorath's attack, but her voice was steady and carried the harmonic resonance of a hive mind speaking with unified intent. She demanded confirmation. She wanted the evidence verified independently, outside the control of any single delegation. I told her it was already being verified. The transmission I had sent contained raw data, unprocessed, unedited. Communication logs with embedded authentication signatures that could be checked against each delegation's encryption records. Chemical analysis results formatted in the standard Concord scientific notation. Fleet movement data tagged with temporal coordinates that matched the navigational logs of ships currently in orbit. I had not merely gathered evidence. I had gathered evidence in the languages, formats, and verification systems of 12 different civilizations. 2 years of invisible work, paying for itself in a single moment. The doll ambassador regained her shape. She was shorter now than she had been before, a sign of extreme distress in a shape-shifting species, and her features kept shifting at the edges, as if she could not decide what face to wear. She asked one question, and it was the question I had been waiting for someone to ask, since the moment I walked into the chamber. She asked how a human had done this. I told her the truth, the same truth I had told Salith in the maintenance bay, but shorter, because time was running out, and the blast doors sealing the Vayanori wing would not hold forever. I told her that every species in this room had been given a gift: telepathy, bioelectrics, gravitational control, shape-shifting. These gifts were extraordinary, and they had built extraordinary civilizations, but they had also created a blind spot. When you can read minds, you stop watching faces. When you can manipulate gravity, you stop building tools. When you can shapeshift, you stop learning to read body language. Each gift had made its bearers powerful and dependent at the same time. Humans had no gift. We had no shortcut, no inherited advantage, no biological cheat code. So we developed something else. We developed the ability to pay attention to everything, all the time, without relying on any single sense or ability. We learned to read the world the hard way, through observation, through trial and failure, through the slow accumulation of knowledge earned one painful lesson at a time. I had seen the conspiracy because I had been watching from a place none of them thought to guard, the gap between their gifts, the space where telepathy could not reach and bioelectrics could not scan, and gravitational sensors could not detect, the space where a human with a leather journal and a stubborn refusal to stop thinking could sit for 2 years and see everything. King Vorath rose from his throne. His luminescence had stabilized, but his face was a mask of controlled fury. He declared that I was a spy, that humanity had planted me on the station to undermine the Concord, that the evidence was fabricated, the product of a primitive species attempting to sow discord among its betters. 3 delegations hesitated. The accusation was powerful because it played on existing biases. Humans were new. Humans were distrusted. Humans had no seat of real power. It was easy to believe that a human would lie to gain influence. But then the Kreth delegation spoke. General Mavok, the senior surviving Kreth officer, stood on his platform and said that the chemical analysis in the transmission matched compounds found in Ambassador Drethin's quarters, compounds that the Vaenori security team had declared non-existent during their investigation. He said that his own forensics team had detected traces of the same compound, but had been told by Vaenori security to disregard the finding as contamination. The Rithak matriarch confirmed that the communication logs in the transmission matched internal frequencies used by a military faction within her own delegation, a faction she had suspected of disloyalty, but had been unable to prove because they were shielding their communications using technology that her hive mind could not penetrate. One by one, delegations began to speak. Not all of them supported me. Some were skeptical, some were hostile, but the evidence was in their hands now, in their own formats, verifiable through their own systems. The truth had escaped the bottle, and no amount of telepathic pressure could put it back. Vorath made his move. He broadcast a telepathic command to the Royal Guard, ordering them to breach the blast doors and take the council chamber by force. I felt the command ripple through the air, a sharp pulse of psychic energy directed outward toward the sealed corridors. The response was silence. Not because the guards did not receive the command, but because Salith was on the other side of those doors, and she was doing exactly what she had promised. She was using her telepathy, not to attack, but to countermand. She was telling the guards, in the voice of Vaenori royalty, to stand down, to wait, to question the order they had received. Vaenori soldiers were trained to obey the royal family, but the royal family had 2 members on the station, and they were giving contradictory commands. The guards froze, caught between 2 authorities, and in that frozen moment, the political ground shifted beneath Vorath's feet. The Dahl ambassador called for a vote, an emergency resolution under the Concord's founding charter, which allowed the assembled thrones to suspend a member delegation pending investigation of charges against the peace. It had been invoked only twice in 3 centuries. The vote was not unanimous. 4 thrones voted to suspend the Vaenori. 3 abstained. 3 voted against. But the Concord Charter required only a simple majority for emergency suspension, and 4 was enough. King Vorath stood on his platform and watched his authority dissolve. His luminescence blazed, bright and terrible, and for one moment I thought he might launch another telepathic assault, not at me but at the entire chamber. A final, desperate attempt to force submission through sheer psychic power. He did not. Perhaps he calculated the odds and found them insufficient. Perhaps some fragment of dignity restrained him. Or perhaps he looked at me, standing on the floor below him, a human with no gift and no power and no throne, and understood that the age of inherited dominance was ending, and that no amount of telepathic force could change what had already changed in the minds of every being in the room. He stepped down from his platform. His guard, the ones inside the chamber, moved to flank him. He walked toward the exit without speaking, and the delegates parted to let him pass. As he passed me, he stopped. He looked down at me from his full height, nearly 3 feet taller, with eyes that had read the minds of millions, and a presence that had commanded empires. He said one word: Threnvek. Furniture. Vermin. I looked up at him. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I held his gaze with the steady, quiet confidence of a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated and had decided, at some point during the past 48 hours, to stop being quiet about it. I said one word back: Ethan. He left. The doors closed behind him, and the council chamber erupted into noise. The next 3 days were the most chaotic period in the history of the Concord of Thrones. The Wraithak matriarch purged the military faction from her delegation and submitted their communications records for independent review. The Kreth opened a formal investigation into Ambassador Drethin's death. The Dahl ambassador filed charges of conspiracy against 3 members of her own intelligence service who had been coordinating with the Vaenori. The Vaenori delegation fractured. Vorath's loyalists retreated to their ships. Moderate elements, led by officers who had served under Salith during her brief diplomatic career, broke ranks and cooperated with the investigation. The balance of power within the Dominion shifted faster than anyone had predicted, because Salith did something that no Vaenori royal had done in recorded history. She renounced her claim to the throne. Not quietly, not privately. In front of the full Concord, she stood on the floor of the council chamber, not on the Vaenori platform, and declared that she would not inherit power she had not earned. She said that the throne of the Vaenori had been used to betray the trust of the galaxy, and that she would not sit on it until it had been rebuilt by hands that chose to hold it rather than hands that were born to. The delegates did not know what to make of it. In a galaxy where power was inherited, where bloodlines defined worth, where your biology was your destiny, the idea of voluntarily surrendering a throne was incomprehensible. But I understood it, and I understood what it had cost her. On the 5th day after the exposure, a committee of 8 delegations presented me with a proposal. In the vacuum left by the Vaenori suspension, the Concord needed a neutral authority, someone who could mediate between the thrones during the transition, someone who could not be telepathically compromised, gravitationally manipulated, biologically deceived, or psychically coerced. They offered me the title of Concord Arbiter, a position above the thrones, a neutral king, answerable to all, and beholden to none. They offered me a human inventory clerk, the most powerful position in the galaxy. I said no. The committee was stunned. 2 of them literally could not process the refusal. A Rithak delegate's bioelectric field sputtered. A Dahl committee member lost her shape for 3 full seconds. I told them that the problem with the Concord was not who sat on the thrones. The problem was the thrones themselves. The idea that power should flow through blood, that authority was a birthright, that the strongest mind or the most gifted body should command, and everyone else should obey. I told them about a concept they had never encountered. I told them about democracy, not the messy, imperfect, often frustrating system that humanity had stumbled through for centuries, but the principle behind it. The idea that leadership should be chosen, not inherited. That authority should be earned through service, not assumed through genetics. That the people, all the people, regardless of their gifts or their species or the accident of their birth, should have a voice in the decisions that shaped their lives. They did not understand it immediately. Some of them did not understand it at all. The Kreth general asked who would protect the weak if the strong were not in charge. I told him that the purpose of government was to ensure that strength was never the only qualification for leadership. The Rithak matriarch asked how a hive mind could participate in individual voting. I told her that was exactly the kind of question that made democracy work, because it forced you to think about inclusion, rather than assuming your way was the only way. I told them I would not be their arbiter, but I would help them build something better, something that did not require a single being at the top, human or otherwise. Something that was designed, from the ground up, by a species that had spent its entire history figuring out how to organize itself without gods or kings or telepathic overlords. I offered to be their architect, not a ruler, a builder, the first architect of the reformed Concord. They accepted. Salith found me on the observation deck the night after the vote, the same deck where she had first heard my evidence. A lifetime ago. A week ago. Time had moved strangely since I walked into the council chamber. She stood beside me at the viewport. Her luminescence was steady, a warm gold I had not seen before. She was calm in a way she had not been since I met her, and I realized that the calmness came from the same place my own quiet confidence came from. Not from certainty, from choice. She had chosen her path, and the choosing itself had given her peace. She told me something. She said that in her 112 years, she had met beings who commanded fleets, emperors who reshaped worlds, warlords who bent the fabric of space, and none of them, not a single one, had done what I had done. She said that I had walked into a room full of gods and I had not fought them. I had not begged them. I had not tried to become one of them. I had simply stood there, a human, with nothing but the truth and a mind that would not break, and I had changed the course of history by refusing to be anything other than what I was. She said I was the only king she could never conquer, and that she had spent her entire life conquering, without realizing that the things worth having were the things that could not be taken. I told her I was not a king. Kings were born. I was built. By every failure, every quiet night in a storage room, every moment of being called worthless, and choosing to keep going anyway. I was built by my species, by every human who had ever looked at the impossible and said, "Watch me." She asked me what came next. I told her the truth. I did not know. Nobody knew. That was the point. Democracy was not a system that promised perfect outcomes. It was a system that promised participation, the right to try, to fail, to try again, the right to build something and tear it down, and build it better, the right to be heard, regardless of what gifts you were born with or what throne you inherited. It would be messy. It would be slow. It would be loud and contentious and frustrating. It would be profoundly, beautifully human. She asked me if she could help build it. I told her yes. Not because she was a princess, not because she was Vianori, because she had made a choice that no one in her position had ever made before. She had chosen to earn her place instead of inheriting it. And that choice, that single, voluntary, deeply personal choice, made her more qualified than anyone I had ever met. She stood beside me, and we watched the stars together.
Somewhere above us,
Delegates were arguing about constitutions and representation, and the mechanics of a political system that most of them could barely comprehend. Somewhere below us, King Vorath was aboard his ship, planning whatever deposed king's plan. Somewhere out there, across the vast and indifferent galaxy, humanity was going about its business, unaware that one of its own had just rewritten the rules. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my journal. The battered leather cover was worn soft from 2 years of constant handling. I opened it to the first page. My first day on Axis Pinnacle. A single entry, written in my own invented shorthand but clear enough in my memory that I could read it with my eyes closed. Day 1. Nobody knows my name. Good. I closed the journal. I did not need it anymore. Everything in it had served its purpose. Every observation, every connection, every quiet note made in the margins by a man the galaxy considered worthless. Salith asked me what I was thinking. I told her I was thinking about rain, about standing in a field behind my house when I was 7 years old, arms spread wide, laughing at the sky, about the feeling of water on my face and the sound it made hitting the grass, about how I had not known, at 7, that I would someday stand in a room full of gods and refuse to kneel. But that somehow, in that field, in that rain, the refusal had already begun, because that was what it meant to be human, to stand in the rain and laugh, to face the storm and keep your eyes open, to be small and fragile and mortal and still, somehow, unbreakable. She did not say anything, but the light beneath her skin shifted to a shade of gold so warm it felt like sunlight, and she stood a little closer, and the stars moved slowly past the viewport like a river that would never stop flowing. I am Ethan Cole. I am a human. I count crates and fix air filters and speak 6 alien languages that nobody asked me to learn. I have no telepathy, no bioelectric field, no gravitational powers, no shape-shifting abilities. I have a leather journal, a socket wrench I made myself, and a brain that runs on glucose and stubbornness, and something that might be hope. They called me worthless. They called me Threnvik. They called me furniture, animal, clever pet. They were wrong. Not because I proved myself in some spectacular moment of triumph, although I suppose I did, but because they were wrong from the beginning. Every human is worth more than any gift, because every human is self-made. We are not born with power. We build it. We are not given understanding. We earn it. We are not handed purpose. We choose it, every morning, every day, in every small, stubborn, defiant act of thinking and caring, and refusing to quit. The galaxy is changing. It will take years, maybe decades. The thrones will resist. Old powers will fight for the old ways. There will be setbacks and failures, and moments when it seems like the whole thing is falling apart. But I am not worried, because I have seen what happens when one human, with nothing but his mind and his stubbornness, walks into a room full of gods and tells the truth. And if one human can do that, imagine what all of us can do together. The stars are out there, waiting. They have always been waiting. And we are just getting started.